I absolutely want to enable bold, creative, new ways of doing things, because the status quo is not getting us to where we want to be.
I wish I had recorded that.
It's all good. I can say it again.
All right.
But we get into the weeds too early, and then it just bogs the whole process down, and then limits the time we can spend, to my point earlier, being more visionary, being more proactive, seeing what's coming down the horizon. But if all we're dealing with the day-to-day, week-to-week, and what's right in front of us, by definition, we can't be proactive. And so I think that's what I mean by the less is more.
Hello, Boulder and the wider world. This is the Sharing Boulder podcast. My name is Philip Ogren, and for our 10th episode, I sat down with Matt Benjamin in my backyard. Matt is considering a run for city council this fall. We covered many subjects in our marathon conversation, including ranked choice voting, parking minimums, zoning, the role of city council, the city budget, effective governance, a living wage for city council, among many others. Matt knows a lot about how the city of Boulder works, and he was eager to get in the weeds on just about any subject, and he taught me quite a lot along the way. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Matt Benjamin. Matt, thank you for being on the show. Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, Philip, this is a pleasure to be a part of this and to share a conversation about our community. And I think the title of what you've put together here is emblematic of my values, is sharing, is how do we make a more inclusive and welcoming community. So I think you're on the right track, and I'm glad to see this conversation pick up, and hopefully we can bring more into it.
Great.
I've lived in Boulder now 21 years, and I'm a father of 2 young kids, a husband, and I spent, like some people are actually, it's actually a pretty common story. Boulder has this just mystique about it. It has, and it'll make sense why I use some of these cosmic terms in a minute, but it has gravity. It holds on to things that get in its orbit. And I was one of those. And I never left. I came to school. My background studying at the university was in astronomy and astrophysics, and then immediately got into helping run the planetarium on campus, where I got to bridge some of my early passions, which was working directly with world-class researchers, as well as education and public outreach, and really trying to help with science literacy. So that's sort of my background here, and then did that for a little over a decade, and in doing so built a lot of grew some of my values that are based on community and education, certainly about empathy and understanding where people come from and how they come to understand the world. Because when you're teaching science, you have to be empathetic to those different perspectives in order to really reach them on complex subjects. And so that's really what started. I met my wife about 12 years ago playing recreational volleyball in North Boulder. We were on opposing teams to start, which I found kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And
eat it, right?
Oh, there was a moment I blocked one of her shots, and she is a great volleyball player and very competitive. And I remember her demanding that her team feed her the ball so that she could spike it on me. And I think that
true love.
Oh yeah, and I think she got one on me, which I think really was like, and then she had that sportsmanship of gotcha kind of thing. And I think at that point I was like, all right, you're my kind of person that's not going to shy away from a challenge.
That's cool.
And so we've been together ever since, and married for going on 7 years now. And my son Mason is 6, my daughter Avalyn is 3.
Wow.
And so we are a young working family. Both of us work, and my daughter has spent half of her life in quarantine, so that is a very informative and interesting perspective to gain as a parent, but also to think about ramifications on children. And my son Mason's about to start kindergarten, and after a year of kind of quarantine, it's how do you reintegrate in socialization? I feel I need to go to summer camp too to kind of reintegrate into how to be socially adept and skilled after 18 months away from that and being virtual.
Definitely.
So, yeah, and then so that's a little bit of background, and then what really sort of got me to where I am now is sort of a really, I'd say, three things specifically jumped out. First is, interestingly enough, because we're going to, we'll talk a little bit, or the subject matter of the week is the CU South Draft Annexation Agreement.
Mm-hmm.
Well, 2 weeks after the flood in 2013, my dad and brother died in a plane crash.
Ouch.
And there is an assortment of trauma that anybody or any group of people can go through, and one or the other isn't worse in any way. Everyone has to goes through that in their own right. But for me, it was losing the two people I was closest to, and really trying to figure out what does that mean for my life, and really, as you come out of the dark, somewhat of that deep grief, you really have this choice in life of you let the grief consume you, and that leads to a lot of dark things, perhaps addiction or poor mental health. A lot of really bad things can lead it by letting that grief take over. The other option I had was finding a way to be bigger and better and embody a lesson my dad gave me, which was, and it was in all things, whether it was at a campsite or wherever it was, is leave it better than you found it.
Yeah.
And it just seemed to be this constant theme in everything that sort of fatherly advice embodied. And after going to my dad's service and my dad and brother's service, I saw what he had done, and I saw that at 63,
because people came together and testified to what
100%.
his life and what he did.
You're right.
That's cool.
And it's kind of weird because I think we all, when you're kids, you don't really know your parents outside of being your parents.
Yeah.
I mean, you know what they do, but you really don't know.
For sure.
And a lot of times, maybe there's a generational thing that there was a little separation of church and state, if they didn't want that work life to invade the home life.
Yeah.
And so I didn't know. I mean, I was 31 at the time when they passed away, and I didn't really know.
Yeah.
And it was, to your point, at this service, 1,100 people
at
that memorial, and I was hearing from people from all over California and even across the country of the impacts he had in bringing about change.
What was his career?
He ran a construction business in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just, you built this thing. It was all his work with nonprofits and his philanthropy.
Yeah.
And it just left this mark of, I have to piece together my life on the back of this. And my brother was 28 when he died and barely got a chance to impact his community. My dad at 63 had so much more to give and already had such an impact. And I thought, I don't know, you realize how futile life can be, right? So you realize it's right in front of you. It could be next week, next year, what have you. And I like, I need to lean all into being a steward of my community. And that was really that core decision at that moment was, what do I need to do to better my community, to make it better off than I found it when I arrived here in the year 2000? And that was the building block for starting for myself to get engaged in local nonprofits that were focused on childhood education and conservation and good governance. And then it was in 2017, it was like, I'm going to run for city council, and I'm going to go all in. I want to just dive deep into this because I care about it and I want to make impact. And that was 2017, and then I just stayed really involved in local politics, served on campaign finance and election reform working group, and then was fortunate enough to be asked to lead the coalition, which supports a number of candidates in 2019. And then last year, created and then ran the campaign for Our Mayor, Our Choice, which...
Congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah, which was a chance for Boulder voters to elect their mayor using ranked choice voting. And so all of those things have kind of led me to this opportunity to run for council through experience, lived experience, and really being in a position to listen to our community.
Can we digress for just a moment? So have you had any second thoughts about Our Mayor, Our Choice after watching what happened in New York and all the news around that? Or
no, because what's interesting is the issues that happened in New York were emblematic of just human error.
Yeah.
Not anything fundamentally wrong with the system or process of ranked choice voting. Yeah. And in many ways, it really just showed that in spite of the human error, the system still worked as it was intended. And so to me, it was in many ways a validation. I think there might be, we're dealing with some of this post-truth society as a whole. So there's a whole swing of ways one can swing different instances. But I thought it was a great validation of the system on such an immensely large scale.
Yeah.
I think it passed the stress test. It did what it was intended to do.
And then what's the update for that in Boulder? We're going to have it in 2023?
That's correct.
That's okay.
Well, what we had to do is, so there's this kind of chicken and the egg that kind of got going, and it's sort of emblematic to Boulder. Boulder is a change maker. Boulder, when we set our sights to do something, we tend to impact the state.
Yeah.
And voters passing that resoundingly with nearly 80% of approval really led the state to have to kind of urgently adopt some new state standards for the Secretary of State's office to provide guidance and resources to effectively implement a ranked choice voting election here in the city of Boulder. And so had we not passed that, that state legislation would have died on the vine. But because we passed it, it created the urgency and it got a lot of people involved. I helped play a little bit of a role in shaping some of that legislation to make sure it fit Boulder's needs. But and the governor just signed it a few weeks ago into law, and now this wonderful synergy is created between the state and the county and the city, and we're ready to go. But more importantly, our actions have now opened the door for all these communities.
People are watching, paying attention, thinking about it now.
Exactly.
They're going to see how it goes.
And not just thinking about it. It's now going to be on the ballot in Broomfield, ranked choice voting.
Yeah.
It's almost going to likely get on the ballot in Fort Collins. The city of Denver is likely to get it on the ballot here soon. So look what Boulder did. We created this spark, and now boom, all these little pockets of reforming our democracy have sprung up, and we helped lead that. And I think that's a really emblematic but important thing to reflect on how Boulder's been a change maker for a number of years.
So before we leave that subject, is there more to do with respect to how we vote? Like I feel like I heard recently that we could have ranked choice for all of City Council, and that's not happening in 2023?
No, we would have to pass a separate law and change our charter to how we elect council, and I will be strongly advocating for that, not just during this campaign. If I'm fortunate enough to be on council, I would like us to actually really aggressively pursue election reform for council. There are a lot of issues with how we elect council and some of the byproducts of our system that I think a lot of people in the community have started to sense are unhealthy or perhaps adding to some of the toxicity and polarization in our community. So we can't quite do that. In terms of what's left for us, the biggest thing we'll need to do is work with our county clerk, Molly Fitzpatrick, and our city clerk's office, and to really do a proper education campaign in terms of really making sure the voters really understand what to do, how to fill out their ballot, and to make sure that they really understand how to do it. Because when you look at the exit polls from a lot of communities that do ranked choice voting, with a proper education up front, you get like 80 to 85% of the voters say that was better than what we were previously doing.
That was pretty fun.
And you want that. But if you don't do the proper education, you can sort of taint the well, and it makes it harder to be successful down the road.
Yeah, cool. Well, I kind of derailed you from your intro. You were
it's all good.
You were doing 3 things that had led you to.
Yeah, and I sort of mentioned the one was clearly being that the tragedy and that self-reflection that comes from wanting to then be a steward of my community and the environment. And number 2 was the election of Donald Trump. Being in your mid-30s and seeing that older generation in many ways fumble the football more or less on critical issues and just show a general disrespect for future generations, to me was like, well, that's my generation, and we're just now entering a position of having the experience both in work and life, having perhaps the money and the time to get involved in local politics and actually start making those changes and take back the reins of what our community and our country should be. And that was a big galvanizing force. And the third one was having children. Having kids changes you.
It changes you.
As much as I want to think that I was thinking beyond myself without kids, no. Once you have kids, it indoctrinated me anyway to be purely focused about future generations and being less concerned about my own or myself for that matter. And all 3 of those things really sort of molded together to really say, like, yeah, now's the time, but more importantly, this is the community that I want to fight for, and I want to make sure that future generations have the same or better opportunities than I did in this community.
Well, I really admire that, because I think that sometimes when you have kids, you actually focus more on yourself and get sort of more defensive and like carving out your
Sure.
area of protection or of safety and your interest. I mean, because running for city council, there's some kind of amount of exposure that gives you that. I don't know if it's a security risk or whatever, but just it's like it to have an externally facing response to having kids, I think is really admirable. I just admire that.
I
So
appreciate that.
yeah.
There's no doubt you're protective of the kids.
Yeah,
Certainly
no,
coming out of COVID.
of course, yeah.
100%. But yeah, no, I appreciate you saying that, and it's about the kids, and I think one sort of personal experience that kind of connects me to things like housing and transportation and general affordability in our community is, I mentioned that my wife and I met 12 years ago playing recreational indoor volleyball. There was a group of about 10 of us that had spouses, soon to be spouses, or already had young kids, and so effectively 10 family units from that group in volleyball. Today, only 2 left in this town.
They all moved
All
out
moved.
of state or
Just
surrounding.
the affordability
Yeah,
pushed them out of this town.
yeah,
And I talked to them today, and they're like, I would love to live in Boulder.
yeah, for sure.
And affordability pushed them out. They were
Yeah.
fine maybe as a couple in a townhome or a small house or whatever, but as soon as they wanted to have kids, they couldn't expand. And and the crazy part is they make really good money.
Yeah.
And still the barrier to entry in our community, and they couldn't evolve in our community. And I it bums me out in a serious way, because I know they're not the only ones, and I see us really losing our young working class families, which in many ways are the injection of that vitality that communities like this depend on long term.
Yeah. So well, let's go ahead and pivot towards housing,
Yeah.
and lean into that. So maybe just give us a positive vision of what you would like to see housing to look like in Boulder. Like, what kind of policy changes would you make, or maybe if that's too specific, just kind of generally speaking, what's going on with housing in Boulder, and what do you want to change?
Well, I can't really paint a rosy picture of our current
There's a lot of
housing.
nice houses.
There are.
You could start there.
There are a lot of nice houses, and in many ways, a lot of the houses here match the surrounding beauty of this community in Boulder, and maybe that's by design or just what happens when you live in a beautiful place, that what you build in many ways feeds on that. But our housing situation is not in a great place. It's okay, but it's not great. And I think a good example is the recent community survey that said, I think it was like 73 or 75% of those surveyed said affordability in housing is an urgent need. Well, that's up like, I think, 20% from when a comparable survey was done just like 6 or 7 years ago.
Yeah.
And you kind of go, well, if our policies were making the proper changes, you'd see the urgency go down because we were actually solving the problems. But to see this urgency continue to rise tells us we're just not meeting the needs of those that wish to live, work, and play in this community. And so I think it's just worth having a very general status and reality check that it's not just affordable housing in its perhaps formal definition. Its general affordability in this community is continuing to become more and more exclusive and pushing people out that we in our community depend on for the vitality of our community.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that disconnect is what we have to try to overcome in a lot of ways. And so what does that lead to? Well, certainly there's your sort of more formal affordable housing. There's middle income housing, and then there's largely, what do you do with the rapid appreciation of single family homes in this community? Because there's plenty of single family homes all over the place that you'd want families to be able to move to because they're near schools or they're in 15-minute neighborhoods. And I can just speak to my area of South Boulder. I've been there now about 13 years in South Boulder, thereabouts. Yeah, about 13 years in South Boulder. And I've seen a lot of homes go up for sale and a lot of families move in. If there are families, they tend to be older families where their kids are in middle or high school. But really young working families, I just don't see it. And that worries me about our elementary schools west of Broadway. And that canary in the coal mine is how BDSD is navigating reduced enrollment west of Broadway and seemingly can't build schools fast enough on the east side of the county.
Yeah.
And you kind of go, there's this disconnect. And so to me, there's a lot of signals and warning signs saying we're not doing enough. And um, it concerns me because that vitality that I want to see making this community better than I found it is not going in that proper
Yeah.
direction.
Yeah. Well, so then what are some policy changes you'd like to
It's a great question.
make?
I think one of the most important things is we just have to be more expeditious in how and where we decide to put truly affordable housing or mixed income and mixed use housing. And I got to give council some credit. That recent conversation with the Diagonal Plaza, they met that urgency. They could have taken the slow, long route of doing a land use change and rezoning the whole thing. They could have gone that route, which would have delayed that years or derailed the project as a whole. They went for the path of least resistance. And so I want to give credit where credit's due, that we're starting to maybe see a shift on some of this affordable housing. The Waterview project out on Arapahoe,
Yep.
that got unanimous support. And I go, okay, like, let's build on
There's
these
some hope there,
successes.
yeah.
And I have a little bit of hope that we're maybe starting to understand that we got to pick up the pace.
Can you give the listeners just a quick, thumbnail sketch of what happened at the Diagonal Plaza?
Right, so at Diagonal Plaza, this is the area where the old Sports Authority was. There's a current Walgreens, I believe. This is where the local DMV is, and for lack of better words, it's just a derelict part of that area of just this massive parking lot, empty buildings. It has really no vitality on the northern and western edge.
Is it?
And
I'm sorry. Is it west of Foothills or is it east of Foothills?
it's
Because I thought the area that was under question was actually east of Foothills, but I might be mistaken. I guess I have to look at the map.
No, it's across the street from Safeway at like 28th and
Oh.
Iris.
Nice. Okay.
Um,
It's funny that I've been following this.
Yeah.
And my mental map was wrong. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, this has been an area for well over a decade that has been identified as a place that needs drastic revitalization.
Yeah.
But because of the complexity of having, I think, over a dozen different actual property owners within this construct of area, made it really difficult to try to get any general consensus on how to move things and land use, and zoning.
Yeah, the zoning needs to be changed. Is that right?
Very difficult. Yeah, exactly. Zoning needs to be changed. It's just been very complex. And finally, through a developer and partner with Boulder Housing Partners, and really generally the will of the community, and some conversations with the neighborhoods and stuff, there's a plan to revitalize that with a lot of some market and affordable and some other types of housing in there, which would drastically improve that area. Yeah. And where some of that affordable housing really connects well with the properties that Boulder Housing Partners already has.
Yep.
So there's a lot of synergy there that really helps to build a community that doesn't make it sort of disjointed and blocky from different partners. And having the grocery store nearby and a number of restaurants and improved retail, it's exactly the kind of project we need now. And what was going to hang it up was, there was really two forks in the road. It was do a whole new land use designation and then rezone the whole thing, which would then require input from all the property owners, or just provide a special designation for this particular wedge of property to give them just a different way of calculating the open space requirement for that set of properties. And then they could go ahead and you wouldn't have to include and or deal with the uncertainty of including all the property owners. Council chose the path of least resistance. They said, we're going to give you the special designation. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I would bet house money that council would have chosen the long, slow process for that.
Delay it
Exactly
as a nice side effect.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
And that's where I want to say where credit is credit due to the current council for understanding the urgency and moving swiftly for the path of least resistance. Do we say rah rah, we've done it? No. I think what it does is it shows an example of how we can move forward and be more, like I said, expeditious in where we think of bringing a more affordability to our community sooner rather than later. Because we're running out of time in order to bring that affordability into our community before we reach this sort of point of no return where everyone's priced out and we've become sort of an aged, old retirement community. And the clock's ticking. And so I think we have to work even harder to overcome some of those natural forces on a community like ours.
So, I, one little bit of concern in the way you sort of set this up at the beginning was affordability for families that are expanding.
Yeah,
But I would say that there's a lot of affordability issues at every level, right?
there is.
Like people living by themselves or living
Mhm.
with roommates or elderly people. So, like, because to me, my reaction to like worrying about expanding families is like, well, you know, in terms of affordability for single family homes, that ship has probably sailed. And I mean, like when I think about increasing affordability, it's sort of more like let's focus on townhomes and condos and denser housing. So is that, or you're hopeful that we'll have more affordable single family homes, or
Well, I mean, it's not that that single families need single family homes.
yeah,
I don't pair them together.
okay,
And so, and if I maybe I perhaps maybe misconstrued in my communicating that, it's more of we have a demographic that is being pushed out of our
yeah,
community, and by the nature of just middle income housing as a whole, it's far more complex, and there are far fewer tools in our tool set in the city and in the community to bring about that type of efficacy, right? Real affordable, true affordable housing, you've got state and federal subsidies, you can leverage dollars that are raised through cash and lieu. I mean, it, you can do so much more with so little money for that type of affordability than you can for middle income families, because the
the
mechanisms,
missing middle,
yeah,
yeah,
they're just, the mechanisms aren't quite there. And so to your point, yeah, what are those things? Well, clearly you could be looking at where you have single family zoning, and I would start with areas that are near transit corridors to think about, well, can you on certain types of parcels start to divvy them up to do duplexes and quadplexes? I don't think we need to move to a citywide, all zoning. I don't like blanket one size fits all solutions, but I think we need to start looking at where we can start doing that, and start to build that into our repertoire of what our housing policy is. Because you're right, single family homes left as is aren't going to become more affordable.
yeah,
I mean, that's
yeah.
just not going to happen. So, what can we do to leverage the property and the space that exists in those single family zones to create pockets at the very early onset where we can encourage affordability, by effectively amortizing out through people and building the inherent property cost and cost of the property itself in this community?
What's your hesitancy towards like changing lots of zoning? I mean, like to me, I would like to see lots of single family home zoned areas
Mm-hmm.
get liberalized, rather than just here at the margins or in a few spots. So
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a
maybe
good
speak to that.
point. I think maybe, perhaps that's the end goal, and maybe this is just seeing how some of these battles have played out in our community.
Sure.
That I think a blanket policy like that, if that was sort of the initial thing to come out with, would be met with an unfathomable amount of
Yeah.
resistance
Yeah.
that would then unfortunately scuttle the concept in its entirety.
Yeah.
And much like we've seen with ADUs and also co-ops, the fact that it was done in a smaller sense right off the bat with some guardrails attached to it, in many ways allowed us to dispel those misconceptions.
Yeah.
Right? You remember the co-op arguments and the ADUs. There's gonna be trash everywhere. There's gonna be noisy parties in every street. There's gonna be too many cars. None of that fear mongering came to fruition. And now we can have a conversation of expanding those programs because we now have the actual data and the case study to say, yeah, that fear mongering is not a real thing. We can actually get to actually pragmatic policy. And I think with regards to modifying single family zoning, that type of process and strategy, I think in the long term will benefit us versus the risk of having the whole concept scuttled because we maybe shot a little too hard on the initial
Sure.
salvo.
We had Dave Ensign
Yeah.
on for our second episode, our second interview, and he kind of stepped through like some of his efforts to change
Yep.
zoning, and just kind of like we're talking about, just some modest proposals for certain kinds of zoned areas. And I mean, if modest proposals are going to get that kind of rejection, a blanket wide
Yeah.
city thing. But my pushback though is feeling this sense of urgency from where like, do we believe we're in a climate crisis, and do we believe our land use has anything to do with that? When you start thinking
Yes
about
and yes.
well, when you think about, like, a prospective home buyer kind of weighs their options, and are they going to buy something a bit bigger and nicer out on the exurbs where they're just uh, basically guaranteeing that they have to have a car at their disposal for everything that they do? Or are we going to, as a society, make room for people near city centers and 15-minute neighborhoods and this
Yeah.
sort of thing? So I guess my pushback to that is, like, when do we acknowledge that there's a crisis and that land use has something to do with that?
It's a great question. I think we acknowledge it now. We should have
Yeah.
acknowledged it 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think one of the core things that I'm going to focus on in my campaign is that we have to stop being reactive in the policies that we pursue. Outside of perhaps COVID and the flood, everything we're dealing with, we've seen coming.
Yeah, it's just marching towards us.
None of that stuff's a surprise.
Yeah.
And yet we are using reactive policy to address these things that we've seen coming. And I think that from a philosophical but a process perspective at the city, I want to advocate that we start to look over the horizon, and council, I think, needs to shift how it operates from being this sort of managerial body to kind of like, and I give Ed Byrne credit, he said this at the Raucous Caucus, of, we should be more of a board of than a managing group. And I think if we're more of like a board of directors for a nonprofit, we can be a little more strategic and visionary and really help guide on those longer term trajectories that will then allow us to have greater sets of tools at our disposal to deal with problems before they just show up and hit us in the face. And so to your question, to your issue about urgency, it's urgent. And so we have to kind of do both right now. We have to kind of pick up the pieces because it's falling apart in front of us.
Yeah.
But also making sure that we're not so...
we need to bring people along with us.
Right, but we also have to make sure that the solutions we do are also preparing us for those future changes that we also see coming. And that makes it a little disjointed in that process, but that doesn't mean we can't kind of be currently addressing while also being forward thinking.
Yeah.
And that's where you start to think about, where you mix housing and transportation together, where we should be reducing parking minimums or eliminating them entirely in many of these larger developments, because if they're along transit corridors, there's no need for cars.
That's right.
And if we're building these 15-minute neighborhoods, we're effectively eliminating the need for a car. And also, we're not building the space for parking, we're providing more space for housing.
That's right.
So there's
there's just that inherent
synergy.
cost that of each parking spot is a lot of money.
Totally.
Right? And so, I mean, if you want affordability, one of the things you can do is make it less expensive to build housing.
Exactly.
Right?
And as much as this community will some people will demonize developers, at the end of the day, their math has to work.
Yeah.
They don't work for free. They certainly don't work for losing money.
Yeah, well, they don't build too much stuff after a loss.
So when we have these parking minimums, we're forcing them to create market rate that's exceptionally high market rate to subsidize the very parking spaces and the affordability we're requiring of them.
Yeah.
So our policies are exacerbating the very problem that we've identified. So there's there's this disconnect and a lack of consistency in what we state as our values and the policies we enact. And I see, thematically in my campaign, I'm going to be focusing on, are we investing in our values? Are we being consistent? And I think that's a big open question that I don't think we're passing the test on. But it's important for us to really consider how we're being true to our values and where we actually provide the policy.
Well, that was a nice segue into something I wanted to circle back on, which is you made this a nice case for what the role of city council should be. And as I've, part of the reason I'm doing this podcast is to educate myself. I hope I'm bringing some listeners along with me. But as I've sort of started to understand what city council is about, I feel like we have this Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan that has this list of core values that are very like progressive and actionable, and they're like all right on. It's like we should do all these things, and I just sort of feel like city council gets in the way of letting the city staff implement those values. And
I agree with you completely.
yeah,
I think there is a systemic issue of micromanagement and being an armchair expert
yeah,
with council. And that's why I say it's just like a board on a nonprofit. I serve on a few of those boards, and you got to let the experts that you hire, you got to enable them to carry out the strategic vision that you as a board have set.
yeah.
And I think, and we have the Tipton report from 2019 that came out that effectively just laid the case for why we are seeing some of this dysfunction is what we have.
Yeah.
We have created such a toxic atmosphere with regards to empowering our staff to carry out those values that when they do carry out that strategic mission, and then some folks in the community have outcry against it, city council throws their hands up and throws staff under the bus. I mean, we've had an exodus of very qualified and capable staff in an array of departments. And, if Boulder's going to tackle these complex challenges, we need the best people. We clearly have the best community. So we should have the best working environment to match that in order to attract the top talent. And we should be enabling and empowering staff to do that work. And council should take a few steps back. I said this when I ran in 2017, and I've only further been galvanized in my belief that council does too much. And one thing I learned in time working not just with
Intervening to slow things down,
Yeah.
perhaps, is that kind of like broadly speaking what
It
they
is.
do too much of?
It's do too much, but also, another way to say it is less is more.
Yeah,
And I learned this in my time working with, a lot of the research faculty at the university and on a couple NASA projects I was fortunate to be a part of. You build a spacecraft, you can't put every instrument on board, but what you can do is put a few that are fantastic
yeah,
and are great. And that's what NASA kind of does. And I'm not saying we need to be like that, but that was where I really understood that like less is more, and more importantly, that if you try to do too much, all the things you're trying to do get done in mediocrity. And there's a lot of that's being done to some extent in mediocrity, and not by design, but by just it just isn't the capacity to do things great.
I want to clarify because like I feel like generally speaking, the city isn't doing enough to enact these core values. So I want the city to do more, but maybe what you're saying, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but if the city council could get out of the way and let them do more, or are you actually really saying that the city should kind of like focus on a few key things?
Maybe it's a good differentiator. If council steps back, that doesn't mean the city slows down.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's an important piece here is step away and provide a little bit of space for the staff to take care of the vision and the priorities that council's made, and let the council say, look, we're not going to get into the minutia of a lot of this daily or weekly stuff. We're going to let staff settle that. And if stuff has to rise up for some critical needs, we'll address it. But more importantly, we're going to trust the staff gets it. And when we get to something that's almost fully cooked, hey, check in with us. And we'll help tweak around the edges and make sure we're on point. All right, good, let's go, sign off, move on. Yep. But we get into the weeds too early, and then it just bogs the whole process down and then limits the time we can spend, to my point earlier, being more visionary, being more proactive, seeing what's coming down the horizon. But if all we're dealing with the day-to-day, week-to-week, and what's right in front of us, by definition, we can't be proactive. And so I think that's what I mean by the less is more. Council needs itself to be in a less is more state so that it can start to really think about what's coming and really start to put our values in conjunction with our policies.
So let's circle back just a little bit further.
Yeah.
You were going to tell us what policies related to housing you'd like to.
Yeah. So I started talking about
happen.
in terms of giving credit to council,
Yep.
and so I think let more of that, right? I think that let's speed that up. Let's find the paths of least resistance, and let's really start to look at where those places we need it, and drive staff to say, look, without cutting corners and being risky, let's start to really drive some more of this conversation of bringing up some more housing in these environments, in these areas. I think, the alpine balsam needs to come right back into a very important conversation. I mean, there's only so many places to do infill in a strong manner in 15-minute neighborhoods. So
Yeah.
it's not this blanket development across the city. We know exactly where we are, and it's these tiny pockets, and we've got to nail those and get them done sooner rather than later. And I think we just have to press staff on the urgency of that. So that's more of just getting the job done and doing some of what recently we've seen doing that's working. And I want to say, yeah, more of that. Just hit the gas pedal, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I think we can be in a good shape. Specifics on some of the policies, I think, one of the things that jumps out to me with regards to the affordable housing stuff is we need to think about somehow recalibrating our cash in lieu program. That to me is really this conundrum, I think, for the city. Because one of the values I have is that mixed affordability and mixed socioeconomic diversity is really healthy for not just our community as a whole, but even smaller neighborhoods and enclaves within Boulder. But the way we've set up the system is we've set it up so that developers can opt out of creating inclusionary housing by giving the city money to then build it somewhere else. And so we're actually creating segregated communities as a result. So we want inclusivity, but we give them an out to create segregation, but then it gives them city money to then go ahead and build affordability. And so it's like it is, and so I get why we need that money, but I think we need to have a larger conversation in our community about why are we allowing developers to opt out. Yes, it funds a lot of affordability, which our city needs, but it does so at the cost of inclusion.
Yeah, at the places.
At the places we want it, and there aren't that many places left. So it's important that we really make sure those areas are inclusive, but we've got a process that allows that to not happen. And so I really think that needs to be more seriously looked at, because all we've sort of looked at is the dollars and cents of cash in lieu and trying to find that calibration point of, well, we don't want too many opt-outs, but we don't want too few. And so we just set this price point that's like 50-50. And I'm like, no, I think we have to have a deeper values discussion about what are we actually trying to achieve, because we've created this inherent conflict of interest with the city as a result. And I struggle with how we continue forward with that and then generate the outcomes that we've claimed to value with inclusion and diversity. So that's a piece. I don't have a solution, but I think we need to unleash our staff and some creative minds on how we find a way around that sort of contradiction in values.
Well, since we're kind of in this, in this orbit of inclusionary housing, in the places where it might otherwise get excluded in cash of lieu, lieu of cash. How's it?
Cash in lieu.
Cash in lieu. Yeah, sorry.
Cash in lieu of the building. Yeah.
Right. David Adamson is working really hard to try to get projects where you have gentle infill.
Yep.
And kind of, basically market rate affordable housing,
yeah.
right? So micro condos or co-housing situations. Mm-hmm. And what's your feeling about those kinds of projects?
So I've had a lot of conversation with David over the years, and he's been a tremendous sort of community advocate for the non-status quo way of thinking about affordability.
Yeah.
And one of the things that he advocates for and I support is community land trusts.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, what we have is the buildings aren't becoming unaffordable.
Yeah.
It's the land we're
Yeah.
on. And so if we can have mechanisms to decouple brick and mortar from the rapid appreciation from the land, we can actually maintain affordability without things like deed restrictions and other things that then limit, and that's, deed restriction sort of a separate beast. We've leaned really heavy on deed restriction for its, the comfort of permanent affordability.
Yep.
But that permanent affordability comes at the literal cost of people being able to move up the economic ladder in our community.
Yeah.
And I think deed restriction is a tool, but I think it's been over-prescribed in our community when we're not leveraging some of these other tools like community land trusts. And I think whether it be through nonprofit or the city as a whole, buying the land and decoupling that brick and mortar from the land itself, I think these are great tools in our toolkit to provide some greater affordability opportunities. The other piece, aside from that community land trust and that sort of gentle infill, really has to do with where we can really attack with some very specific zoning changes. especially along our transit arteries. And I think when we've got, low density residential along transit arteries, to me, that's not the most effective use of that land and zoning as a function of, one, creating affordability, two, trying to keep some cars off the road, and really, three, making sure that we're actually meeting our goals of inclusion and diversity in our community. And so I think those three things right off the bat are ones I'd like to see explored, aside from the, hey, whatever, what we're doing at Diagonal Plaza and Waterview, more of that. I think those three things are really helpful tools to get us moving.
So this is just a question. I realize I don't know what the setup is. So the city bought the Alpine Balsam property.
Yeah.
So are they considering a community land trust model for that area, or is that
not that I'm aware of?
So it'll all just get sold, either at market or at deed restricted affordability.
From what I can tell, I think that's where it's headed. There's certainly some of that nuance, and I think it's, the original plan has been sort of scrapped, so it's kind of been back to, and there goes the lawnmower.
There goes the lawnmower. All right, so is there anything else to cover related to deed restricted affordable housing at this point, or you want to move on from that?
No, I think it was just really to sort of tie it up, is that is it's a tool and we should use it, but I think we've leaned on it too heavily, almost out of a reluctance to pursue other ways of creating affordability in our community. Yeah. And again, if we're going to be proactive, we need to do so with as many tools in our tool chest. And deed restriction seems like it's the last resort of reactionary housing policy, because when you start to think down the road 5 or 10 years, you don't have to lean on deed restriction to achieve affordability if you're really starting to plan ahead and think about 15-minute neighborhoods and inclusion in a long-term solution. And I think that's why we can look at rezoning and community land trusts and where we actually deal with the cash in lieu and true inclusionary housing. I think a more balanced approach actually might get us a little closer to our goals than we're currently headed.
Well, I guess one thing I think about is if you just think about the supply-demand curve, maybe we should just try a lot more supply. That would be one way to try to relax housing prices. I do have, maybe I shouldn't be brainstorming quite on the spot here, but it occurs to me that do we actually know what happens with deed restricted affordable housing as you get decades out? Because it seems like if housing, the market rate housing continues to sort of accelerate in its expense, and that diverges from the fixed appreciation of the deed restricted housing, at some point I wonder if that distance, that gap getting large, it doesn't have some kind of unintended consequences that we just don't know about yet.
That's a great, I think that's, I don't know enough about that to speak intelligently on that. I think it's a good question, and I think, maybe there's ways to calibrate deed restriction over a long period of time where you can allow people to move up the socioeconomic ladder as a function of how long they're in deed restriction, and provide off-ramps for the city to recalibrate the price of that property back in alignment with whatever the current affordability marker is based on area median income. So again, sort of spitballing.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem like the most pressing issue
it doesn't.
On the plate.
It doesn't, but I, so I'm just brainstorming, but I do, again, but this is can we get creative? And maybe that idea is just dead on arrival because it's just, maybe there's something that prohibits that, and who knows. Yeah. But I think largely, what it gets to is we should not be afraid to try new things. I think we've gotten ourselves into a mode in the city where we let perfection be the enemy of the good. Yeah. And the perfect example is Alpine Balsam. It just wasn't perfect for people, and therefore it couldn't happen at all.
But it was perfect. Didn't you see the plans? They were so beautiful.
I mean, it was just the gray box, right? Yeah,
no,
exactly.
I thought that looked amazing, but what do I know?
But and then there's the other side that we tend to think tank our way to solutions rather than just trying.
Yeah.
And I think that's so antithetical to so many folks in this community.
An organic city that has lots of interests and like you said, you don't have to have one size fits all solution. Let's try lots of different things and see what works.
Well, and I'd say, as the saying goes, you can throw a rock in this town and hit a PhD. Yeah. Well, you can also throw a rock in this town and probably hit some exceptionally successful business people in this town.
Yeah.
Whether you're a research scientist or you're successful in business, your success is built on failure.
Yeah.
So I would argue that for our community, we should measure our success on some of those failures too, and not be afraid to take chances and try new things. And yet we kind of just hold ourselves hostage because we have to find the one solution that has zero chance of failure, and we just aren't taking risk.
Yeah.
And I just don't see that as being emblematic of what so many folks in this community have used to become successful, and we can't apply that to our community values.
I think one kind of humorous way to push back on that is a lot of the things we're trying to get done aren't really that risky. because I mean, if you think about some of these projects, I went on a tour of what was then called Attention Homes. I think they've rebranded to Together.
Mm-hmm.
That property. The CEO of that organization was explaining how the neighbors were so concerned, and there was a lot of pushback from the community. And I just wonder if those neighbors are so upset right now about having that facility in their neighborhood. Like, I doubt it. I bet they're like, whatever, and this is I think history has repeated itself over and over again. Once the development goes in, people see it's like, future dystopia. It's actually not so bad. In fact, we like people in a thriving neighborhood. So, actually this is an improvement.
In hindsight, it doesn't seem that risky at all.
Sure.
But in the moment, to folks in those neighborhoods, I empathize with their concern. I think it can sometimes get blown out of proportion, and we make decisions perhaps focusing on the voices, the loud voices of a few, rather than perhaps the greater community good. And I think that's where the risk aversion comes from. Some of these, in hindsight or even in the moment, don't seem that risky. They seem like almost the obvious thing to do. But the forces that are limiting our capacity to embark on those journeys are I think, because of that general risk aversion, is they just don't want to take the chance.
Yeah.
And I think we have, and if we can't, now is the time to start taking those chances. And this is maybe where we get to thread perhaps some of the conversation of the budget into this, because the city just received about $10 million from the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, and they're about to get roughly another $10 million in about 6 months. And this money is specifically geared for underserved and underrepresented communities that have been disproportionately impacted by COVID. Well, that's effectively most or all of of the individuals and groups in our community that need affordable housing and or part of our hospitality service industry that got absolutely devastated by COVID. So, and or minority communities or are unhoused and homeless, they all fit the bill of this money going to serve their needs. And almost all of their needs are housing needs. And so I think it's really important that this is a chance for us to really take, not risk for being risky, but to really push the envelope, because we are getting money that means we don't have to take money from something else to achieve an outcome.
Yeah.
That's always the debate in our current budget process. Well, you want to do more of this? Well, what are you going to take money from? Oh, but I still like that too. And then we end up not being really that visionary because everybody likes the current services that we currently have. But with $10 to $20 million about to come in, this is the perfect opportunity not to just do more of the same of what we've been doing, but to really try to think of new solutions and be creative and try new things that we otherwise would absolutely not touch because of how it would cut other parts of our budget. And so I really hope that we can see that opportunity in front of us. And the other big opportunity that's going to come for our budget is going to be talking about the library district and how that frees up $10 to $14 million in our city's budget to, again, go to other things that we want to achieve. And, as a whole, you talk about 10, now 20, $30 million. I mean,
That's starting to be like 8% of the budget or something like that.
That's almost the entire annual budget of our police force that we get to then kind of just be thoughtful and perhaps progressive with how we invest in our values and how we think about going forward. So I think we're at a very important and I think opportunistic time with regards to how we're coming out of COVID. There's a massive community self-reflection of what are our values. And we now have these opportunities through a library district and through the ARPA money to really think about how do we want to reinvest and recalibrate our priorities, be it for housing and transportation and how we serve our unhoused, or maybe how we take care of some of the backlog with regards to our deferred maintenance on open space. And, I think there's a lot of those interesting things that we've only been nibbling at the edges for because we're trimming little money here, little money there. But boom, this injection of money is, I think, a huge opportunity for us in our community.
So it seems like another opportunity for increased revenues is closely related to increasing the amount of housing we have. I think we spent $50 million on the Balsam Alpine. So, I mean, was that a loan? Are we going to get that money back? Or I guess maybe that's not, I guess that wasn't money. That must be, sorry. That must have been loaned.
I don't know the answer to that. I do know that not all of that is a sunk fixed cost because so much of the evaluation, analysis, and zoning conversations and all of that work on surveying the land and knowing all that doing the transportation, the trip routes, all of that analysis will be absolutely valuable in whatever the next iteration is. So I think some of that cost will roll over to whatever this next version of Alpine Balsam is. So I mean, maybe, but I don't think it's all like, hey, we just sort of threw money in a fireplace.
Oh, no, I didn't mean that. I just meant as you develop that and then you sell it, that money goes somewhere.
True.
If the city paid $50 million for that, I assume they'll get that back plus some. Not to mention increased property tax. And I mean, it seems like if you increase housing throughout the city, you're going to have higher property tax revenues, which it seems like an obvious, if you're short on money because you're spread too thin, maybe it's because you're literally spread too thin. In terms of single family homes, it's not a very efficient footprint for city infrastructure like sewage systems and electricity and markets.
And property tax, to be clear, doesn't really provide a lot of money for the city.
Okay.
And so it's there, but a lot of that is state and county. I mean, so we get a small pie, and so we do get an increasing percentage of that.
So most of ours is sales tax.
But a lot of it is that sales and use tax in terms of where we can really prime the pump, to use that analogy, for really boosting our economic vitality, but more importantly, really boosting revenues. And
I was testing you. I was testing you to make sure you understood your city, municipality, government 101.
And that brings back to another, again, this sort of reactive versus proactive governance. We saw in the fall of last year that, vaccines were coming out and we were going to start to have an opportunity to start to open our businesses back up. And perhaps in time for the summer rush. And the three departments that took the biggest hits from the budget cuts were libraries, parks and rec, and our planning department. And, libraries, there's reasons, the in-person, the indoors, there's some issues. Obviously, you're closing those places down, so that made sense. In the moment, I think, it's probably time to bring it back. But aside from the justifications, we saw that we were starting to come back online, and we had an opportunity to see, the city's revenues are down 8% because of sales tax loss, because people just aren't out spending money in the community, especially downtown or on the hill or other places. So how can we, when we do decide to open the community up for business and go in person, how can we be ready to maximize the revenue generation, the moments we can open? Instead of starting from a dead stop, how do we start that with a running start? And what we missed the opportunity to do was to invest in that moment, to use our reserves, which we've been overly fiscally conservative about. I would argue if not for a pandemic, what are the reserves for? I mean, and we barely touched them. Like we were waiting for some worse pandemic or worse apocalypse. And so to me, it was a missed opportunity, again, not being proactive. And this is a chance where we could have invested in our planning staff, inspectors, and those moving through things, especially, plans and remodels and new businesses that were trying to come in. We had some businesses waiting 6, 8, in some cases 10 weeks for what was a basic inspection. And they missed many weeks of the early summer rush to generate the very sales and use tax revenues that we need to reopen our libraries, to hire back our park staff, or more importantly, generate the revenues to reinvest in some of these other community services. And now we're sort of kind of behind the 8 ball because some of these businesses lost a month of that revenue generation. And that's that, again, we were reacting, not thinking proactively on how we could be ready for what we knew was coming. And we sat on our hands, unfortunately. And now it's almost too late to make that investment, because by the time you hire the staff and get them trained, it's going to be October, and we'll have missed that summer rush. So,
are you talking right now in this scenario? This was 2020 or this year?
In terms of
the missing some of those opportunities.
Missing the opportunities because we still have businesses that are in the long pipeline. Long
I know,
pipeline.
but which year are you talking about? This was last year?
It was last fall that we started to see this happening, and realizing that in summer 2021 we were going to start to open up for business. And were we best prepared to have our businesses and our staff and all of that ready to go, so that when we open for business, we could capitalize.
So we've been kind of lagging this summer.
Absolutely. I mean, I've talked to a number of business owners who were like, I waited 6 weeks and I missed all of May for what was a basic, alarm inspection.
Ouch.
And it's just because they're short-staffed, and we just haven't hired them back. And we could have easily $1 million to hire that staff, get them back in, and would have made that $1 million back by July.
Yeah.
Right, so that's the immediate return on investment. That's that sort of, some say fiscal responsibility. I would say what's fiscally responsible is actually knowing how to properly use your money when you're in the middle of a pandemic and you've held reserves for these crises, and we're in one, and we go, oh, we're saving it for what? Yeah. That's the, those are those, again, we're not investing in our values. And I keep coming back to that, because it seems like no matter what the issue is, we have these stated values, and yet our actions just aren't commensurate with that.
Yeah, so I just, just a plug for the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan. If you don't know what those values are, they're just like, they look pretty good, you know, and it'd be really cool if we just really went all in on realizing those. So, let's see. Did you finish doing policies that you're interested in? Because I just sort of wanted you to say occupancy restriction. Bedrooms are for people.
So I mean, we can certainly talk about bedrooms are for people. I support bedrooms are for people. I was fortunate enough when we were doing the Our Mayor, Our Choice campaign to be working alongside bedrooms in gathering signatures. We each had each other's petitions, and we were in front of King Soopers and McGuckins and you name it, collecting signatures in the middle of a pandemic, mind you. And I came into it with actually some bias when I first, had talked to Eric and Chelsea about bedrooms early on. And my bias led me to think, this is really maybe geared for just college students or recent graduates. And I was quickly proved wrong by that. And when I was out collecting signatures and people came up so enthusiastic about signing the bedrooms petition, but more importantly, it wasn't just they were enthusiastic. I saw the diversity of people and their different stages of life. There were people in their 50s that were saying, this makes a big difference for me. There were people who were young professionals, people who were retired. There were young students. There were people who were working in our tech community. There were hospitality workers. I mean, it seemed like it was going to impact almost everybody in this community in a positive way. And it really opened my eyes up to, you know what, this actually, I think this is really onto something in terms of how we can improve not just affordability, but create more access and inclusivity. Now, I will say that there are areas in our community that have reason for some concern with regards to what might be unintended consequences of bedrooms. I think of, a lot of the folks on the Hill, and I think of that area is already probably maximizing almost all of its bedrooms on the Hill as it is. I'd say it's other areas that have the empty bedrooms, places in South Boulder, maybe a little bit of east, and certainly maybe north. But on the Hill, they're effectively utilizing all the bedrooms already.
So it has very little impact. Is that what you're saying?
I would say that my worry is that the impact will be on and I hope it's not the case, but a concern that's expressed that I have to say I'm curious about, I would like to know if it will happen, is whether or not property owners around there may decide to sell or turn their property, what would have been for a young working family or some family unit, and they go to rental, and then we lose that opportunity for people to buy into our community instead of them sort of just being rented. And so I don't know, but it's a concern. It's a real one that those neighbors have, and I want to be sensitive to that.
I would push back on that in the following way, that those single-family homes that on the hill are never going to be affordable again. You know, they're just not. There's just no economic model that allows that to happen, except for a collapse in demand, which would be catastrophic for other reasons.
And that may be true too. I mean, the other part that I think is maybe worth looking at is whether or not current property owners would sort of just chop their that home up into like 12 bedrooms.
Yeah.
And I think
if you have a house that would actually be big enough to make them
and do
with
we
the
have
egress and
right and so again,
sure.
Not sure these are things that will happen, but I do think it's important that when a policy like this becomes citywide, that I think it's responsible for someone, an elected member on council to think of, well, what are these issues, and can we provide some guardrails so that people aren't abusing a policy that is intended for just these sort of positive community benefits. So I just think it's worth us having that conversation and looking at it. I support bedrooms and the work they're doing, and especially coming off on how they got absolutely shafted by the city attorney's office and council last year. I think they absolutely deserve this bite at the apple, and I think are going to be very successful. And a lot of credit to the campaign team that they could have gone so negative and dark off what happened to them last year, but they actually just evolved their petition, made it stronger, and came at it again. And I think they're better out.
So I was involved this year.
Oh, good,
and so
fantastic!
I helped with gathering petitions and signatures, and I had the same reaction as you. Is man, this thing has really wide appeal. Like you get different reasons from lots of different people for why it's important to them. So I just I'm excited. I really hope that it passes.
Yeah, I do too.
How do you feel about ADUs?
I think they're a wonderful tool to provide not just affordability, but also for, in some cases, income for people who want fixed incomes as their property values increase. I see that in my area of South Boulder. Single-family homes. There's a few of them that have ADUs, but a lot of the people that have lived there are on fixed income, and they've been there 30, 40, 50 years. And home values have tripled in 15 years, and that's a stretch now on fixed income. And so to be able to do an ADU when you still want to live in place, I think is a very valuable tool in some of those areas, like where I'm at. And to be honest, I live 3 or 4 houses down from an ADU, and
it didn't ruin your world.
it's like it doesn't even exist.
So you're open to liberalizing the rules around it, or do you feel like they're fine the way they are?
No, I think we should definitely look at where we can increase their usage. Again, I think the reason why it was capped where it was to appease a lot of the fear that it was going to destroy neighborhood character and create trash on the street and too many cars and loud parties. I haven't noticed those disruptions.
Yeah.
And maybe there's areas where it is. I haven't heard. I haven't seen it. I would not be, again.
But we have enough data now to
like
revisit it and say, hey, here's the 80s that went in since the last time we refreshed this policy.
Let's increase it by 30%, right? I mean, and again, not to say that that's too small or too big, but I'm saying there's no reason why we can't just keep increasing, and then maybe we reach this critical mass of ADUs where maybe there aren't.
That's enough now.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know the answer to that, but to just be like that's enough, I don't think is also the right answer. So I would support exploring some expansion of that, because it's, again, I can only speak for my neighborhood. It's not hurting my neighborhood.
Yeah.
And I know the property owner who has it, and they're delightful, and it's awesome.
So
great.
Do you mind if we pivot towards transportation?
Yeah.
Maybe give us a vision for what you see as you'd like to see happen in Boulder for transportation. What's working well? What are our biggest challenges?
Well, like we mentioned with the Boulder Valley Comp Plan, there's fantastic values and vision in the Transportation Master Plan. It's a great document. It would, if we can only get to a place where we empower our staff to meet the ambition of those ideals that are in the master plan,
step us through.
I think we're in a great spot. I mean, one of the big pieces is, we keep talking about multimodal, but we're in this sort of transitional state of how do we get to multimodal.
Yeah.
And one of the things that jumps out to me is we sort of mentioned it before, is getting rid of parking minimums. Yeah. I think this is a huge start, because some of this is future planning where we're not quite ready to enact the policies, although we have set the marker where we want to be. But that's where we can meet the challenges of now to set us up for the future. And that's where through housing, we can say, we're going to get rid of parking minimums. And that increases our likelihood of truly creating multimodal communities with how we set that up by building in the reduction of our reliance on vehicles. And I think that's where we can sort of tether the now and the future together in a meaningful way. I think one of the other parts has to do with how we're dealing, underpasses and increasing our bike lanes. One of the things I saw, certainly in my network of friends who are, have young kids, one of the things, certainly as a lot of the parents were home working, was many of them got like rad wagons or other bicycles to take their young kids everywhere, because it's like, well, now I'm home working, I don't need to drive a car, and let's go hop on our bike and go places, and we're not going inside. So it's been great to see a massive growth of the biking community in Boulder, but it's also come at some cost, which has been a lot of the people I know. I say a lot, I mean a number of them. I'm not going to say more than the majority, but a number of them are concerned about bike safety, because they don't quite have a mastery yet, or just aren't comfortable riding on streets with cars buzzing by. And I think there's maybe a need to think of how we decouple cars and bikes in a way that provides that safety blanket for people that maybe aren't daily or super tacticians of riding bikes through our community, and they want to do it, but there's an apprehension because they're like, there's a few of these transitions from one spot to another where I got to be on a street for 2 blocks, and now I'm not making that leap to then be on the bike to make it all the way to North Boulder. And I go, we should not. We've got barriers to entry for people to get on bikes, and that I don't like the sound of that. And I think COVID maybe accelerated maybe some of that inevitability, or increased the dependency on the current biking system we have. But it really illuminated for me the need to really start to be clear with where are these bike lanes, how do we decouple, start thinking about more of these underpasses. I use them all the time when I'm biking, and I like being able to navigate without having to get in with cars. So those are a few of the things that I think are more pressing because of COVID and a community urgency to want to be on bikes. And I think we should foster it before they regress back to being in cars, because they realize that the bikes were maybe not that our community was not 100% ready on infrastructure for them to enter that biking community. I would really hate for a regression there when we're really close to making that really full transition,
I appreciate all of that. I'm really a passionate cyclist myself in terms of using it to get places. And one of the things that sort of drives me crazy is we have so many residential streets that are 40 feet wide with parking on both sides and 20, two-way traffic. And it seems like there's a lot of places where you could change it. You could just reconfigure all that asphalt, take some of it out, maybe put a bike lane, have parking in a one-way. Just let's be creative, because these 40 foot wide streets are these big heat sinks, and they're not attractive, and they encourage fast driving. And anyways, I would love to, to your point about parking minimums, I would love to not grandfather them in, so that people that have lots of parking nearby them could raise concern and be like, hey, there's a lot of other things we could do with this space.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, the one that jumps out to me is that Wells Fargo lot over on Walnut and Broadway.
Oh yeah,
Right?
Oh, man,
I mean, it's like
I used to work across from that,
Okay.
and I used to stare at that. I was like, that must be worth so much money if we
worst
could
possible use of land, and the lot's like maybe at best a quarter full.
Never full.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So I'm like, oh God, what an inefficient use of space and land, and terrible for our stormwater infrastructure.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
yeah.
just it's negative on a lot of aspects.
Yeah.
So, I think there's a lot of those pieces there, and you bring up a good point. One spot that comes to mind that I remember it was in the conversation about Chautauqua and the parking permitting system, and that was the one lonely mosquito.
Yeah, the mosquitoes. They're
just showed up.
They're starting to show up a little bit.
And I'm used to having my wife around. She's the great attractor for mosquitoes, so usually I don't have to worry. But when I'm solo, I'm like, what are these bugs getting on me?
They don't like me too much at all.
My wife attracts them for my and children's benefit. So that conversation on the hill, on 9th and some of those other streets, is one of the things that I found interesting about zoning is they're not allowed to have driveways in many of those homes.
Oh, interesting.
And so you kind of go, so they're forced to be on the street. But if you allowed them to be in their driveway, you could then create a bike path on the street given the size of those streets.
Yeah.
So there's those little things. I'm like, oh, why couldn't you just let them have a driveway?
Yeah. Interesting.
And so that was something that came about because they were complaining of like, well, as residents, we have to park on the street. And someone was like, well, why don't you park in the driveway? And they're like, we're not allowed to have driveways. And I think it was kind of that like, wait, what do you mean? So very interesting, but these are those little pieces I think you can sort of work through. But I agree with you on how we think of, and not every street needs to be massive to accommodate everybody. And I think we can start to think about, well, where are our main thoroughfares? And do we want to think about certain areas that are perhaps one-ways that we can then leverage the space there for really safe biking, but still allow some car commuting to move through those neighborhoods to allow that access? And so, I defer to transportation experts on if and where that's viable, but two-way traffic on every street, to me, I don't know if that's necessarily in our long-term best interests if we're trying to also create a semi-decoupled environment for safe, non-car traffic and movement of people.
Yeah, I really appreciate the bike infrastructure that's here, but when I think about what the city could be with respect to cycling, we're still like I think of myself as a cyclist because I don't have a car. Well, I have access to it. My wife has a car.
Okay.
let's be, I do drive, but I get most places on bike, and I feel like I'm a second-class citizen as a cyclist. I mean, it's not safe and there's the city's just handed over to cars. I mean, it's designed around cars. We're in a neighborhood right now that I've observed that is walkable by proximity because we're close to a few things. There's a Safeway over here,
right?
But it's not walkable by design by any stretch. This is like, the street right out here that no one even drives on is 40 feet wide, and it's like we should just have some imagination around how to reconfigure things. But,
I agree, and be willing to try new things in different areas, and that comes back to that risk aversion. And one of the things I'm strongly advocating for, which is just getting rid of of areas that need to have parking or need to have cars.
Oh, yeah.
Like the closure of West Pearl. Like, let's keep that closed. My statement is close it to cars, open it up for business. Like, if you walked that in the last 6 months, or hell, when they started the temporary closure, to me, I walked through it, I'm like, this is the way it's always should have been. And it's amazing to see the spill out and the people eating outside and the vibrancy. It's like, I do it with the apprehension of it's fleeting because I'm worried that this is temporary.
Yeah.
Versus like this is permanent. There is something to attach to. And I'd argue the same thing on like 13th Street between Pennsylvania and College on the Hill. Like create this sort of walkable strip and conduit where we can reduce some of our dependency on cars.
We were talking about parking minimums and West Pearl being extended and how nice that was. And one of the things I would love to see is a pilot project come together where we have far less parking. then so something like that senior center on Arapahoe, and 33rd
Mm-hmm.
at the Freuhaus
Yeah.
camp store. They're the amount of parking they're going to have there is very restrictive,
Yeah.
as I understood it when it got approved.
I think you're right. That's my impression.
And I think there's opportunities for that sort of thing in a lot of places around Boulder. With a property that just kind of comes to mind for me, and I don't know the history or who owns it or what's possible there, but at Baseline and Broadway,
Mm-hmm.
Basemar, and then going back behind it, it seems like that would be such a perfect place. It's close to the campus. It's close to bus routes, to have a new kind of housing development go in where it's like literally there's just no cars there, or just just enough for the car share that you would need, that so people can reasonably have access to cars when they need them. But just in terms of daily life,
Agreed.
we're not just getting, those residents wouldn't just be getting in their cars to go to their places, so.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that is in line with that sort of theme we've sort of been talking about. Is there are a well established known group of locations like Basemar and Diagonal Plaza and others that you go, these are the perfect places for that kind of gentle infill,
Yeah.
where it's mixed use, it's mixed affordability, and you don't need cars because everything you could need is within 15 minutes.
Yep.
And it's like, and so to that sort of multimodal vision in the TMP and walkable neighborhoods, we have to start walking the walk, no pun intended.
No, it's not even a pun. It's just literal.
And so before we start thinking about larger community investment in multimodal and changing of zoning, to me, I think the real litmus test is we got to be able to do it in the places that are the most obvious.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the true test. And that's where we should really focus our efforts, because I think that's the proving ground for how we then up or downscale those models and processes for other parts of the city that by definition are going to be smaller in their footprint, because we just don't have that many large piece parcels like Basemar and Diagonal Plaza and a handful of these others, and Alpine Balsam, right? To really do things and go in a solid direction in that sense. So yeah, I mean, I think that's just important for us to really be like, no, let's identify those areas and be like, here, and we're going to really get after that. We'll really work with the developer and say, we have a community need. There's community benefits to this. It meets all of our goals, transportation, housing, or climate goals, right? I mean, if it's checking off all the boxes, there's no reason to be hesitant in the pursuit of those outcomes.
Yeah. Well, when I think about the climate crisis, I mean, what seems like a basic truth that just everyone's just like, oh, la, 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 is that we're going to have to get out of our cars if we're going to like really curb our carbon footprints
or move electric. I mean, I
well,
think there's something to be said that can be part of the transition of that.
Okay. Yeah. I I don't have any hope that electric cars are. I actually kind of feel like the opposite about electric cars, and that they kind of give us the illusion that we can just keep doing everything we're doing, only greener. And I would just love to see us just stop driving everywhere. It's not necessary in so many situations. But yeah, electric cars are cool. I think electric bicycles are way cooler.
I agree. We have two, and
Yeah.
we swear by them.
Yeah, it really.
Especially living up a hill. I hate
It really,
coming home sweaty.
it really changes the equation in terms of where you can get to and how you can get your business done, and yeah. So,
And I just think just moving my children, right? I mean,
yeah,
I think of like trying to pedal up that hill with two kids dragged behind me.
yeah.
I'm like,
I used to live up on Shanahan
Oh, okay,
Ridge.
yeah.
So
I mean, there's a lazy side of me that's like, the last thing I want to do is go to Southern Sun with my family, have a beer or two, and then think of dragging that family up the hill. Like, no,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
So it's like, but I got an e-bike that I can put the two kids on the back of. And I'm like, oh, okay, I can kind of lean on the throttle a little bit and not,
That's pretty cool.
So, they're, but what that does, it means now I'm on my bike rather than driving a quarter of a mile to a restaurant. So
Yep.
I think those are those incremental but important changes to one's radius that they think of how they can be different in their habits.
Yeah, well, and especially another way I think about this issue, it has to do with, my first reaction to bedrooms are for people was like, this sounds pretty good. I guess my one concern is the cars. What do you do about the cars of people living in fully occupied houses? And I guess the theme that needs to come out is as we increase the number of people, we decrease the number of cars, and those just have to go in opposite directions. And
I agree.
People generally speaking like other people. I mean, we
We're a
are
social species.
we're a social species. We don't like other people's cars, and for lots of good reasons. And so if we can. I think one way to make density and infill and rezoning and all these things that we've talked about more attractive to the people who really want to resist that is sell a vision of a future where there's just a whole lot less cars.
Yeah.
And I think people can see that is a better future. Yeah.
I agree with you, and I think that's an important concern for the next council to consider, assuming bedrooms passes. Are as I said, there's going to be some maybe unintended consequences of bedrooms. By no means should any of those be a reason to scuttle the large community good that comes from it. But I do think that council should look at some tweaking ordinances that help, again, put some guardrails on it. And I think the car thing's interesting, right? I mean, if it's a 3-bedroom house and you're 3+1 and there's 4 cars in a 3-bedroom, okay, I don't know if that's too much of an issue. But 6 cars at a 5-bedroom house, that might be a bit too much and have too much collateral impact on neighbors in that particular neighborhood, where we might need to think of an ordinance that says, no more than 4 cars, period, whether you're a 4-bedroom or a 5-bedroom. Like, we just cap the number of cars at a residence that is occupied through the bedrooms are for people. I don't know how to structure it, but I think we can find ways to curb some of those unnecessary impacts that work against our other values, like reducing cars and vehicle miles traveled.
Does Tabor allow us to make it expensive to park cars throughout the city, or do we have to? Is that a new tax, or do we have tools at our disposal now to just make parking expensive?
Tabor doesn't have anything to do with the parking authority in terms of setting up like special parking zones or permits. That's not considered a tax. It's considered a fee.
I see.
Okay. And so you can kind of skirt Tabor, as best as I know, through fees. That changing I think council's already discussing whether to change the parking rate.
Okay.
That's not a Tabor conversation.
Okay,
it has
sorry.
no impact. Thankfully, because it provides some at least flexibility without having to go to the voters of, do you want your parking to go up 25 cents? Almost everyone's going to say no, and will not raise revenue, right? So, or create the disincentive to drive your car, which is, I think, another perhaps benefit of increasing rates. It's kind of like a gas tax, right? It's a way to throttle those pieces, or a tobacco tax, right? So I think it's a way to social engineering, more or less, is one of those pieces to curb habits. But I don't know how you could do. I think I don't know what types of mechanisms you could use other than making an ordinance of saying that there can be no more than a maximum number of cars. That's one way to do it. You could also just create parking districts. Now, one of the things that they do, like on Chautauqua, and they're actually talking about maybe doing around Tantra Lake when CU South eventually gets developed, is worrying about spillover parking on the neighborhood streets. And so what the city does have authority on, and they've done this in a few areas, I think near Sanitas and Mapleton, is they'll give the residents there a certain set number of parking passes, which means they can park there at any time, but anybody who doesn't have a pass is only limited to park there for 2 hours before getting a ticket. And so there's a way to say that, of like, okay, in this particular neighborhood zone or whatever, you're limited to, each home's only got 3 parking passes. And you want to play musical cars every 2 hours to park there, you do so at your own risk. And that's a way to do that.
I don't know how popular this suggestion is, but I just keep coming back to the fact that we have way too much parking. So let's remove some of it, even on the residential streets. But I don't know if that's on anyone else's radar. That's what I'd love to see.
And I think that's a reasonable goal to have. I think that's a great long-term goal. I don't think it's going to happen overnight, but it means we need to start taking those incremental steps so that all of a sudden we go, oh, look, We just reduced our parking by 50%, and we just did so on that steady march versus thinking we've got to make these massive leaps all at once. It's those big changes that freak people out. And so much like we talked about how to, put ADUs into play without overwhelming the community. All right, now we can do more and then more. And so I think that, yes, we have urgency, but politically and being able to get the community on board, that incremental approach is the one that seems to work in a lot of instances, it seems.
Cool. Anything else about transportation you want to cover?
I would support a citywide eco-pass.
Oh, nice.
I think back to my time at the university. I used the bus so much more than I do now. And it's because part of it is, one, I don't really carry cash on me. And it's not a really easy way to try to credit card, and it's just cumbersome. And so the cumbersome nature of having to pay in the moment for a bus, I can get around it, but it is a barrier to entry.
They do have the prepaid card, and
card.
I've used that. That's convenient, but
and I can't tell you, forgetting the prepaid card or forget to do it. So I mean, there's just sort of a general life administration that I'm sure could adapt. But more importantly, you just had a city eco pass. That just limited, it just alleviated those barriers of entry. I think we'd have some greater usage. I know I and my family would use the bus a lot more when we're perhaps not in a position to be riding our bikes, or it's winter and we're not wanting to, we don't want to drive our cars. I want to do that, and I don't want as many barriers of entry to do though. And I live just enough on a hill that we can walk to the bus stop just fine. We're walking back home, so we're right on the fringe of where that is convenient. I think we'll still do it, but again, it's those barriers to entry, and I'm sure we're not the only ones that have some level of barriers to entry just because of our current busing infrastructure. But I think that would be a helpful way to get us where we need to go.
Cool. Any other subjects you want to bring up before we close?
Yeah, I think the one that that really resonates for me, and in many ways is this sort of thread that ties through all the issues that we've discussed, and I think we kind of touched a little bit on them, but is really it's effective governance, and what type of evolution and reforms can we do to our governmental process that allows us to actually have better outcomes and to be better equipped to deal with the issues that we face. And the Our Mayor, Our Choice campaign, I think, was a great first step. We've empowered the voters to have direct accountability to the mayor, which we've not had in a century, and we're using a much better election system that empowers more voters and limits the spoiler effect and creates a lot more moderation in the candidates that are provided, and I think it will have much greater results when we actually get to that election. And building on that would be a couple of things. One would be we need to provide fair pay for council.
Yeah, I figured you were going to say that.
And this is in many ways and it doesn't have to. If there's any whiff of conflict of interest as a prospective candidate, it doesn't need to be for me. We'll sign it to say it starts on the day that I'm termed out or whatever, or other candidates. But at the end of the day, this is about equity and diversity and access, but also being consistent with our values. Our city and so many residents I talk to say that we need to have a living wage in our community. Well, the same should be true for those at the highest level of office. They should be paid a living wage. I can't tell you how many people I've run into who my time with them goes, oh my God, they would make a really good city councilman or city councilwoman. And I would be like, yeah, but the reason they say no is because it's not economically viable for them to do so. And I go, man, why? How unfortunate that we have a barrier to entry for really qualified people to participate and help lead our community, but can't even consider it because it doesn't pay a living wage.
Is that something that you guys can get past? If there's a new city council, I can't.
A new majority on council.
A new majority on council. Is that something you can just take care of right away?
No, it would have to be a vote to the voters. The voters would have to decide that. I mean, council could put it on the ballot.
Yeah.
And a lot of times things that council puts on the ballot, most of those actually pass. There's something that, the stamp of approval. Although I do know that historically, there is a whiff of impropriety if council is saying, hey, here's a ballot measure we put on that pays us more. We'll need a group in this community that
An outside.
an outside group that doesn't have to go get signatures. I think I'd be happy to advocate on council to get a ballot measure on that passed. But I do think that just the endorsement of council alone won't be enough to get it passed.
Right, sure.
I think you'll need a community group to actually do the outreach and do the advocacy to
I
really
guess I was
dispel
just thinking
misconceptions.
if you could just get it taken care of,
I wish.
then it's ready to it's in place for the next election cycle, and that would be cool. But,
I mean, I wish for the sake of expedience, but I also think it's important for the sake of the proper checks and balances in our government
totally.
that the voters should ultimately get to decide any sort of compensation for council.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be, dealing for ourselves, and that should never be the case for government. But we should be making a living wage.
Yeah.
I mean, it is without question a 20-hour-a-week job, if not, and depending on the commitment of various different counselors, it's sometimes more.
Yeah.
And quite honestly, we can see that when you watch council meetings, you can see who's putting in the time and who's not.
Yeah.
And if you're paying them a living wage, then we as a community and as voters get to hold them to account.
Yeah.
Versus it's more or less volunteer work. And so if someone's kind of checked out, you're kind of like, oh, they're checked out. But if you're paying them a living wage, there's more accountability to making sure that they stay true to the role that you've elected them to do. And so that's where I think fair pay really can improve the quality of our governance and improve the people who are elected and create greater inclusion and diversity. And that would be coupled with changing our election system, as we mentioned earlier, for all of council as a whole. And I think that's the next big reform for how we think of governance, but how we also think of how we're getting stuff done. Right? There's, we come back to these community surveys where we see increasing urgency on issues. Well, if councils for years now are not addressing the issues adequately to meet the needs of the community, well, that's partly because we don't really have an elected government that is made up demographically and from a set of values like the majority of our community. And so that disconnect means that council is perhaps not operating on the best interests of a majority of our community because our election system does not make that so. It allows for small vocal minorities to get into positions of power that are disproportionate to their population and demographics
which is
in
kind
the community.
of a kind of a tidy narrative for why council drags its feet on all these ways it could be getting out of the way to let our core values come through on a lot of these projects that get delayed.
Agreed. So that's effective governance would be those two pieces. I mean, there's small little parts that I think get more technical, but one weird thing that just doesn't make sense to me is city council is going to pass its annual budget like a month and a half before a new city council is elected.
Oh.
So new city council gets elected and then gets handed another group's budget that they're then hamstrung with for a whole year.
Yeah.
So that doesn't seem appropriate to the electorate, because the electorate is making whatever decision they make. This is who we want to lead our community, and these are the values that we support. And that council can't act on those values because the budget was just decided for them.
How do you get out of that fix? Do you do a one-time 18-month budget, something like that?
I mean, maybe. Although that really messes up staff. That may create some unintended consequences. I might be missing something structural or in our charter or state law, but I don't know why we couldn't just slide the budget 3 months after election. I don't know why we're tied to that as our fiscal year. I get why the school district is tied to its fiscal year because it has to do with the school year. And so I get that depending on the work you do, your fiscal year is based on the work you do.
Yeah.
But I don't really know what dictates our fiscal year and budget having to be in that particular lineup. And then it is oddly decoupled to when we do our annual retreat. So we decide the budget, and then just 4 months later, we do a retreat. Well, in the retreat is where we set our strategic vision of the work we want to do. Well, I mean, in my time in business and certainly nonprofits, usually your annual retreat and your strategy informs your budget.
Yeah, it just precedes it. Yeah.
So again, these things are a little disjointed, and I'd love to hear a reasonable explanation for process or for why that is. But right now, it doesn't seem to make sense to me. And all it seems to do is slow progress. And it almost seems like a legacy of the previous council to sort of maintain influence out of office.
Interesting.
In a weird way. And I don't know if that's direct. I'm not going to say it's directly malicious, but it just seems unnecessary that you couldn't just have a new council and then a few months after they get through some of their early processing and onboarding, you have your retreat, and then the retreat informs your budget. Like, to me, that seems more of a logical progression of how to manage and set your vision and then decide where you're going to invest your money based on that vision and strategy. So those are those pieces of effective governance where I look at them like, we can do better, and then as a result, the issues we tackle are going to have better outcomes because we've created a stronger process, and a more accountable one to get there.
Cool. Well, I think that's a wrap. And you wanna call that good?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me this evening.
My pleasure.
And taking time to answer questions and tell us more about you. I think hope this is a useful resource to listeners to get to know you and make a decision this fall. I hope that you run for city council, and good luck to you in that effort. I know that's a big challenge you're taking on, so good luck with that.
I appreciate it. And thanks for the opportunity to, one, speak with you, but also to speak to those that are going to watch and listen, and hopefully it's a chance for people to get to know me, but also maybe reach out and ask questions. And I would just say for those that are watching, you can reach out to me at MB for Boulder on Instagram, MB for Boulder on Twitter, or Matt Benjamin Future First on Facebook, or Matt Benjamin for Council on a website. And you can reach out to me, and I want to have that dialogue with the community, so don't hesitate to reach out and ask questions, and give me some of your thoughts and ideas on how we can really take our community forward.
Great. Thank you.
This episode of Sharing Boulder was produced by David Adamson and Philip Ogren. Sound and video editing was done by Philip Ogren. The intro music was sampled from Osladum by Gilberto Gil and is available for use under the Creative Commons Sampling Plus license. Please visit us at sharingboulder.us for show notes and previous episodes.